I love a great underdog story. And Oklahoma City has been under the radar for so many years. And these past couple of years, we've just been seeing it come out onto the national spotlight. A lot of your efforts over these past few years are now being seen on a national level. What I would love to do is just kind of hear your insights on what is amazing about Oklahoma, and from your perspective, what you see happening, the exciting developments over the next 5 to 10 years here in Oklahoma City.
All right. Well, sounds good. Yeah. Thanks, Will, for having me on.
Wonderful. First question is, what do you love most about Oklahoma City?
Well, I think we have a unique combination, and I think we might talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, about how we got here and how long this unique combination might be in place. But what I often tell people is, thanks to investments over the last 3 decades, we have a quality of life that matches what you would expect in a city this size or any large American city. But we still have sort of the ease of living and cost of living that might be expected in a smaller place. And to have those two things together, like that you can, afford a bigger house, that you won't spend 2 hours of your day in traffic, but that you can go to an NBA game and James Beard award-winning restaurants and all the other things that you would expect in a large American city, to have all of that is actually really unique. I mean, I could just go down the list of America's top 50 cities, and they're going to lack one of those two things, or at least probably more likely they're going to lack the ease of living and cost of living that we enjoy. Listen, a small town of 20,000 people somewhere in Oklahoma, it's easy to live in and it's cheap to live in, but it doesn't have those quality of life amenities that we have. And so that's what makes it a unique combination.
I love that. And I couldn't help but notice you said those are taxpayer funded. A lot of those amenities that have
I mean, we're the catalyst. Maps initiatives are kind of the brand name that is so well known locally. It's not to say that the private sector hasn't come on top of that many times over. They have, but this didn't really happen on its own. It happened because the people of Oklahoma City were willing to invest in themselves starting in 1993, 30 years ago this year, with the original passage of maps. And they've continued to do that 3 more times. And as we sit here today, we still have maps forthcoming with basically $1.1 billion of investment. I find that when you invest in yourselves, it almost doesn't matter what you spend it on. As long as you're spending it and you're making your city a better place to live, it tends to encourage people to move here. It tends to encourage businesses to invest, and it just feeds on itself in a positive way.
What are you most excited about in the Maps 4 that's coming up?
Oh, they're all my children. I can't choose any of the 16 projects, but I just love, I guess, most of all, how so many of them are clearly life-changing. I mean, you think about the youth centers, you think about the diversion hub, the mental health crisis centers. I mean, these are real human needs, right? I mean, some of the projects in Maps 1 and 3 were super critical to the city's advancement, but were largely entertainment related, visitor related, maybe didn't hit on every socioeconomic level. I mean, and nobody would necessarily say that it was life-changing to experience some of those things. They were city-changing, but they weren't necessarily going to change individual lives the way that Maps 4 projects will. So I'm excited to see that play out. I think that's something we'll be really proud of as a community.
Huh. That's incredible. What excites you most about the next 5 years here in Oklahoma City?
I just think that people don't necessarily realize, if you've lived here your whole life, as I have, it's easy to think, gosh, we have come so far from the 1980s that it almost feels like, how could we possibly do anything else? It's just the advancement is so incredible. And yet, I think what I try to get people to understand is, from a national and international perspective, we've really just kind of finally arrived. And that means that we're just now starting to see the payoff of visitors, investment, businesses, residents, all of this attention on us that we thought we had 10 years ago, but it's like now it's just an order of magnitude greater. So I kind of tell people, I'm like, look, the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I think the change will actually be much more significant than the change of the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's hard kind of to wrap your minds around because it feels like a lot's changed in the last 20 years. Yeah. But, I think it's not a coincidence how many people come to town and they say, this reminds me of Nashville or Austin 20 years ago. and you see what's happened there. And there's pluses and minuses to that, I suppose, but you can't really stop it. You build a place that people want to live in, they're going to live in it. So I think you just have to embrace it as validating of what you're doing. And so if that's the case, that a lot of people seem to think it is, 20 years from now, it's just going to be a totally different place.
I hadn't really thought about that, in that just like the growth has been compounding. The first couple of MAPS projects, Bricktown, the canal, a lot of those things took a while to kind of build and get known outside of Oklahoma City, but now we're seeing that compound.
We've reached a tipping point, and when you're the sixth fastest growing top 20 city, there's no going back.
So one of the things I've always heard about Oklahoma City, it's like it's the biggest small town. Anywhere you go, if you dig enough, you can find that you went to school with this person, or you went to church with them, or somehow we're all connected here. And as we are becoming a primary market, as we grow to some of these sister cities you mentioned, how do we keep that community, that part of Oklahoma City that's unique, without maybe losing some of what was special about, Austin or Nashville 20 years ago? How do we do that?
Well, I don't like to make promises I can't keep,
Okay.
Sure. I mean, I think there are certain realities that come with size that are perhaps insurmountable. Now, having said that, I think we'll always have a slightly different character than New York City. I mean, we're not on the precipice of being that big. But nevertheless, there is certain, when you look at Oklahoma City, 30 years ago, we were like half as many people. Now we're twice that. And, 20 years from now, we'll probably be twice that again. There is a point where some of those connections become a little more attenuated between us because there's just so many people. And I do think some of that's a little inevitable. And I don't know that you can figure out a way to stand in its way unless you make the city less desirable and therefore fewer people move here. But we've tried that philosophy, not intentionally, but we tried that in the 1980s and nobody seems to want to go back to that, So if you build a desirable city, people are going to relocate there. That's just, it is the way it is. So I think you can be smart about trying to stay ahead of the infrastructure needs and the growth. And, that's why we have conversations about things like mass transit and other stuff so that we don't completely lose some of the ease of living that I talked about earlier. But I kind of would tell people just enjoy this unique combination of ease of living and cost of living that we have, because there are people from Nashville and Austin who might tell you it's not so easy to live there anymore.
Sure. Yeah.
And again, we'll try our best to stay ahead of those infrastructure needs, and we have maybe some built-in advantages. Our size, which is frustrating at times, our geographic size, nevertheless makes it a little easier to get around. We have 3 interstates, which is 1 to 2 more than most people have. So we have, some built-in advantages that might alleviate traffic and those other things. But, there is something to be said for the reality. And I'm always one that tries to at least, and maybe I try to soften the blow sometimes, but I don't sugarcoat reality. I mean, there is a reality that comes with growth that will change the way it looks and feels here. But it is what it is, and I think you just got to embrace the best parts of that.
I agree. One of the things I love about Oklahoma City, like anywhere in the city, you can basically get in your car and in 30 minutes be at the airport or be anywhere else. And
I always think people say 15, but maybe you're actually giving a more realistic assessment.
I might drive slower than you. I don't know. Over the past couple of years, I've seen you come out in public and make some kind of challenging statements, some pretty strong statements. And I'm curious, either what do you turn to or who do you turn to? Who is like your counsel for some of those tough decisions,
Well, I listen to lots of different people. I don't know if there's any one person. I just I try to take in, lots of different perspectives. I think that's inherent in my style. But I also think that my choice some years ago, and I've been I've been mayor for 5 years, but I've been an elected official for 13. And I've been around public service, for many years before that. I just made a conscious choice at some point along the way that I was just going to do my best to do the right thing. I know that sounds like, of course, that's what we should all be doing in these roles, right?
Yeah.
But what I have observed over 20 plus years of being around public service and politics is that, of course, that was generally the goal of most people in positions like mine. But of course, there were, to be realistic, there were always competing political factors and pressures that people had to appreciate. And I understood that. But over time, I've observed that many people in other elected positions have really let doing the right thing slip farther and farther down the list of priorities. To where it's not even remotely the first thing they think of, right? They think immediately about some sort of perceived political pressure they're going to feel, either immediately through social media or through their emails and phone lines, or something they're going to have to worry about in their next primary or whatever. And it's like, of course, people thought about those things and those were considerations. But it seemed to me when I came of age in public service that that was the thing we nodded towards, but we also recognized was never could be the most important thing. We didn't want to be reckless, but we couldn't prioritize politics over policy, right? And now it's like when you come across a political figure who clearly prioritizes doing the right thing first, it's so refreshing. It's almost bewildering. People don't know what to do with that person. And this is a real problem. It's a tragedy in current American life. But I just decided whatever the blowback would be, I'm just going to do the right thing. Now I'm in a form of elections here at the municipal level in Oklahoma City that kind of incentivizes that type of behavior. I can basically, ultimately get elected by a coalition of normal Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And at other levels of government, they have to first filter through a closed partisan primary, and it does sort of it changes the political pressures that they're under. Nevertheless, I embrace that, and I love it, and it allows me, I think, the freedom to just do the right thing. So whether it's COVID or the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, or the way that we embrace diversity and the many people, the many different communities within our city, or the way we seek pluralistic outcomes, MAPS 4 being a perfect example of that, where you have 16 different projects that really are responsive to a lot of different kinds of worldviews. Like no pure Republican or Democrat would love that whole package, and that's okay, Those types of outcomes are really incentivized in our form of government, and I love that. I get to serve as I think public servants did in this country for 200 years, and I think it's only a recent phenomenon that they got so disconnected from what was really the right thing to do. I think most people kind of know what the right thing is. I don't think it's actually that complex or complicated. But humans are rationalization machines, so they're always able to rationalize why they can't do the right thing. But what's the point of this if on your deathbed you're not proud of what you did? And I feel like I'd much rather be proud at my accomplishments, which to me is going to happen the more I do the right thing, than trying to seek longevity. There's all kinds of people who have been in elected office for 40 years and have done absolutely nothing with it. And I guess they think that was an accomplishment, but I'd rather be in elected office for 5 years and do something with it and have real legacy. The irony is, I wish people would believe me in elective office when they hear me say this, but the more you try to do the right thing and you really you do it consistently and it becomes your brand, the more respect you earn and the more you actually can transcend the political pressures that you think you're under. The first 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 times you do it, sure. But eventually people go, oh, that's just the guy who does the right thing. I'm not going to bug him anymore. I'm sick of it. He's obviously not listening to my extremist views. And so if you really are consistent with it and build it as your brand, eventually you kind of move past that. But too many people, they're only human. They resist conflict and they resist, pushback. But if they would really give it a go, I think ultimately they'd feel a lot more proud of the work they've done.
Thank you for sharing that. I kept
absolutely.
hearing the words like pride, like I am proud of doing the right thing, and over time becoming known for doing the right thing. And over time, that kind of becomes self-perpetuating.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes the filter that weeds out a lot of what people expect of me.
Mm-hmm.
I also heard in that wanting to create a legacy that you would be proud of that also involved your kids. Mm-hmm. And so I can't help but notice, the first thing I noticed when I came in here, there's kids everywhere. That was a conscious choice by you.
Yeah.
Speak to me a little bit about that.
This room used to have, as long as anybody could remember, the pictures of the old Oklahoma City mayors, which is great to honor history, but it was a room full of old white guys, right? With one exception, Patience Ladding. So when I came in here 5 years ago, I had portraits taken of a collection of 20 Oklahoma City kids, 2 of which are mine, but they were chosen to be demographically representative of Oklahoma City's kids. So not only was it a nice gesture, I thought, to have our future looking at us as we make important decisions in this conference room, but also, I wanted our locals and our visitors to look at these walls and see what Oklahoma City's future looks like, which is 60% non-white, and I think that when I came into office, the diversity of our city was something really city leaders had never talked about. They've never used that word, I mean, there's so many things now that we kind of take for granted that didn't exist even just 5 years ago in terms of appreciating that. So this was one of the things that set that tone.
Instead of the images of previous politicians to live up to, it's the faces of children of tomorrow that are looking at you to impact your decision.
I couldn't say it better. Let's get that on a quote a framed quote on the wall.
No, it's awesome. I love it. I'm a former teacher, so coming in here and seeing this, I'm like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
Seeing the impact of making a difference in the lives of kids here in our city. It's small, but it's huge. We've approved maps for entertainment. We've approved maps for mental health and some additional things. Our state has not been top of the charts in education. And I don't know if this is something that can be achieved with MAPS. MAPS is a city, it's a voluntary tax for city things. But is there ever a way, how could we get a MAPS package put together that people would approve that would benefit the education of kids here?
Sure. So, of course, famously, one of our 4 MAPS initiatives was for schools. It was MAPS for kids. That was kind of MAPS 2 in the series of initiatives. So there's lots of barriers. Even to do that. So to take you back into that history, 93, we passed MAPS 1. It's got the ballpark and the arena and the canal down in Bricktown. And so the brand became popular after a few years. And so then we had this unique challenge of all of the school buildings, of which there were 70 plus in Oklahoma City public schools, were in terrible condition. The school district was having trouble passing bond issues. And this is a digression, but in Oklahoma, you need 60% approval to pass a bond issue, not 50% for schools. So that's really hard. That jump from 50 to 60 is surprisingly difficult in politics. And so it was really a crisis, and the city basically said, hey, we'll kind of lend our political capital to you, and we will go out for a sales tax to try and fund the repair and construction of these buildings. And so that was in 2001, and it passed, and it was called MAPS for Kids. So they just took MAPS and they said, for kids. It's a little different from 1, 3, and 4. They're kind of a different model, but it was taking a popular brand and applying it to education. But as an example of how challenging it is for city governments to support school governments, they actually had to change state law. They had to go to the Capitol and say, we want to run this thing where the city will pay for school buildings. And they had to get the House, the Senate, and the governor to all eventually pass legislation just to even make that legal. It is still illegal, essentially, for the city to support the operations of the school buildings. If we were to put money into education from an operational standpoint, like we said, I think all the teachers in Oklahoma City should make more, $5,000 more than everybody else. The state would just take that much money out of the funding formula that they give our schools. So it would be meaningless and pointless. That's the first challenge, is that we are among most cities, not all, but most cities, in being completely walled off from education. We have absolutely no supervision of that function of government. The second challenge is that there are 24 school districts in Oklahoma City limits. Oklahoma City Public Schools may be the one we talk about the most because it's the biggest and it has the greatest socioeconomic challenges, but there's 23 others. They all have their own elected school boards. They all have their own superintendents. They're all completely independent from us and from each other. So trying to coordinate any kind of, support for them is very complicated. And it would also take an inordinate amount of money to really make an impact. And we only have so much taxing capacity, at some point people will say, I can't pay a sales tax that's 11, 12, 13, 14, 15%, right? So if we were going to try to supplement their budgets in some significant way, even if we could overcome the legal boundaries, or the legal hurdles, there is a point where they have their own taxing authorities. I think ultimately probably the best thing we can do is support what they're doing, and support their initiatives. And they do have, the ability to tax. So here's a perfect example of what that could look like. Last year, Oklahoma City Public Schools, Maps for Kids is a distant memory at this point. I mean, we've had buildings now for 20 years. I mean, and one fallacy that humans fall into is this belief, oh, we did that. We fixed the schools. Yeah, 20 years ago. I mean, like it never stops, like you have to keep rebuilding. And so it was time, as it turned out, even though we fixed up some of those schools, they were 70-year-old buildings then. Now they're nearing a century old. There's just only so much fixing up you can do in some of these cases. So last year, the school district had essentially excess capacity. They could legally go out and ask for more money than they traditionally had through their bond issues that require 60% approval. But that would be a tax increase, essentially. It would be saying to the voters, the property owners, in this case, of their school district, you're going to pay more than you did yesterday. But we need it. We need to fix these buildings up. So they went out for that. It was a bold move. It was the first time in 20 years that they had said, we're going to try to get more. Previous bond issues since Maps for Kids had basically said, we're going to ask you for the same amount of money. You're going to just pay the same as you did before. But here's a new list of projects. But we're never catching up in that way. So they went out for $1 billion bond issue last year. And ultimately there was a funded campaign against it. And so I came out and really spent 2 weeks of my life being a very vocal advocate across every medium I could find, and ultimately it passed just barely, 63%. So I felt like I'd certainly done my part. But that's an example of kind of using our political capital to help them maximize the resources they have at their disposal, but maybe haven't been able to maximize in the past. So, there's probably at some point a cap on what they can pursue, but they weren't at it yet. And in fact, this was the critical thing, their taxation rate, millage rate, if you really want to get in the weeds, was way below Putnam City, Deer Creek, Edmond, and the other neighboring suburban districts. And that's not fair. Our kids in Oklahoma City, the core of Oklahoma City, deserve the same things that the kids in Edmond have. And we didn't have that. Heck, they were way below Tulsa, And so we've gotten closer to that now with the passage of that bond issue. But that was kind of an example of how everybody kind of worked together to persuade the voters to approve it.
If I understood you correctly, you were able to use some of your political clout to help get 60% of the population to approve bonds that were kind of set up by the different school districts, and in this case,
just this one. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Every school district is going to go out for its own bond issue votes. Yeah, and traditionally the more suburban districts don't have a problem passing theirs, but Oklahoma City has had some challenges through the years passing theirs, which is why their buildings are in some cases 100 years old. Yeah, but that's an example. It's challenging for the city. I think we're all trying to look for ways that the city can support the school districts because we understand that education is a critical need and it's something that you're measured by. But at the same time, again, there's just so many of these like operational and legal hurdles in the way of that. This just isn't, city involvement in schools is just not the way the state was set up 100 years ago. And there's just some certain realities we have to continue to try to work around.
Let's switch gears a little bit to some of the industries that a lot of people don't know are here in Oklahoma, like film industry. We're getting some tech startups, some biotech. Can you share some of the exciting developments that are happening there in our city to help kind of propel us out in the spotlight?
Yeah. So the 1980s was an economic depression for the city, mostly because we were so heavily reliant on oil and gas. And so we've, sort of an unspoken primary priority for all city leadership for the last 40 years has been to diversify the economy. Aerospace is probably the leading contributor to that, with Tinker Air Force Base being here and all the follow-on businesses that revolve around that. But now you're seeing other things like bio and tech. Our investments in the Innovation District contribute to that. And the film industry is kind of a fun one. Obviously we've seen the opening of Prairie Surf in our old convention center. That's been supported by the film tax credit at the state level. And another thing is the visitor economy. 30 years ago, people didn't visit Oklahoma City. There was a place maybe they slept in if they were driving from Little Rock to Albuquerque. It was not a draw either for a conventioneer or for a weekend destination, but that's really changed with all of the quality of life investments that we've made. And now you could definitely kill a few days here and really have an enjoyable time. And with the new convention center, we're seeing, a lot of interest from national meetings. And so the visitor economy is becoming a big part of that diversification as well.
If you were to leave us with a challenge, something to focus on, something to do to continue making Oklahoma awesome, over the next 5 years, what would that be?
Well, we got to keep investing in ourselves, and we'll keep getting opportunities to do that. I mean, everything that is worth doing in Oklahoma City costs money, because most things worth doing do. And everything that costs money usually requires a tax. And in Oklahoma, a tax requires a vote of support from the voters. And so, you know, we'll have a big conversation this year about really the basic question. Do we want to continue to be a major league sports city? I would say that's completely redefined our brand as we see it and as others perceive it. And that requires an investment in infrastructure. You have to have a building, you know, you have to have an arena that's modern. So we're going to have a conversation about that in the next few months. And we're going to be asking people to continue to commit to investing in ourselves. Beyond that, we'll have more conversations probably about public transit. We'll have conversations about core infrastructure, you know, streets and roads and bridges. And all of those things, I think, will be thoughtfully presented, and will oftentimes not increase tax rates from where they are today. But we can't stop. And that's, you know, there's always voices who will say, oh, we did all this stuff. Aren't we done yet? And you're never done. You're always building a community. You always have needs. You know, our taxation here is relatively low compared to other places. So the idea that we can, you know, go even lower is not going to lead to the outcomes that people want, you know. So it's not taxation for taxation's sake. We always present a very clear vision, and we have a track record over the last 30 years of following through on it and keeping our promises. And we're going to continue to do that over the years ahead. And so I would just challenge everybody to stay on that team and understand that what got us here is the only thing that will continue this path, and it's investing in ourselves. And we've been rewarded every single time we've invested in ourselves. The payback has been many times over.
It's interesting. One of the statistic I saw recently was Oklahoma City. I believe it led the nation, or was one of the top 3 cities where people donated to charities. Like charitable giving was one of the highest in Oklahoma City, but it was all voluntary. It's like we give so much, we invest so much in maps, but we want to have the freedom to do it. Like as long as we have the choice to do that, like we'll happily do that.
That's what I say. I always often point out in relation to these taxes. I mean, you get to vote on them. You know, if people complain about a previous maps project, I'm like, the voters approved it. You know, you had your moment. You know, you had your chance, and the voters have spoken.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you both just as a leader making a difference here.
Well, thank you. Thanks for what you do, and thanks for stopping by City Hall today.
Yeah.
Take care.
All right. Take care.